Welcome to the Earth Feels podcast.
I'm Rose.
And I'm Christine.
Welcome to Earth Feels, the podcast for people feeling overwhelmed by the endlessly gloomy climate news.
Where every week we have soul-based conversations about climate change and explore the idea that climate change may be happening for us as much as it is happening to us.
If you are ready to shift your focus and secure the future for our kids and our grandkids, then this is the podcast for you.
And yes, we do know how to spell.
Hello, Christine.
Hi, Rose. How are you? Here we are.
Good to see you. And now you're in Vancouver, or Vancouver Island.
That's right. It's a little bit confusing. I'm in Victoria, the city, on Vancouver Island. So, yes.
Nice. Beautiful there.
It is quite lovely. I don't want people back in Northern Ontario to feel too sad when they listen to this. So I won't talk about quite how nice it is here, but yes. And how are things in Massachusetts?
Well, we're in the middle of 28 days to our election, so it's kind of crazy.
Yeah. Now, we're not going to talk about the election specifically today. What is our question?
Our question today is, are you using your climate superpowers?
I like it.
Yeah, that comes from our interview with Harriet Sugarman, Climate Mama, How to Talk to Your Kids About Climate Change. I think everyone should read that book because it helps you talk to your next door neighbor about climate change. But she cites that there are 3 superpowers. The power of your voice, which, as anyone who's listening to this podcast knows, that's why Christine and I started this podcast, was just to get people talking. Climate still can be thought of as the elephant in the room, and you can't solve a problem if you won't talk about it. So superpower number 1 is the power of your voice. Superpower number 2 is the power of your pocketbook. And for me, that I'm just really a believer in put your money where your mouth is. If we all aligned ourselves to buy what we say we want the future to look like, we would change the world.
Yeah.
And then the third superpower is the power of your vote, which is huge right now in the States.
Yes. Well, and you know what? I want to add a fourth one, which is connected to the power of your pocketbook. It's another P one, and it's the power of your plate.
Oh, perfect. Another P word.
Yeah, and it has to do with we all eat at least 3 times a day, most of us. Sometimes some of us a little bit more, some of us a little bit less. But
I was going to say some of us a little bit more.
Yes. And what you put on that plate, where you buy your food, what kind of food you buy, that does create the future as well. So, well, so now we've summed it up. Is there anything else to say about the superpowers?
Well, I guess I would really like to talk a little bit more about the power of our pocketbook. We know that how we each individually address the world that we live in creates momentum towards this consumer society. Marketing gets us to buy a lot of stuff that we don't really think that we need, right? And if we can resist that new pair of shoes or that new car or whatever it is that you really aren't buying out of need, you're buying out of want, then we're not producing it as much. And it seems to me that we're held in the cycle of consuming to buy stuff we don't need. And that keeps us in a job that we may or may not like, and commuting to a job and dressing for a job. And it just perpetuates the cycle of people producing things so that they have a job.
Yeah. And then that job necessitates often having a specific kind of wardrobe that you might not need otherwise. So you buy the shoes and the outfits, where I guess COVID might have shifted that a little bit.
A little bit. Yeah. It's interesting. Like I'm on a million email lists, which I'm sure most people are, but I'm on this this one site that they constantly send me like what the best deals are of the day. In my prior life, I was a buyer. In my prior life before children, BC, before children, I was a buyer for a department store. And so I was perpetuating that whole cycle. And I do love to look. I don't buy nearly as much as I used to because of the climate thing, but also where I am in my life cycle. I'm at the point where I'm downsizing, and I've had all the stuff that I feel like I need to have had, and so I'm looking to get rid of stuff. But anyway, I'm on this one particular list that they're sending me men's suits. It's one of the categories, and men's suits from Macy's, which is a huge department store here in the United States. They acquired almost every little mom and pop department store, and they are now nationwide. I don't know what's going to happen to them, but certainly suits are not necessary anymore. If you're at home, you probably could just take the one suit coat that you have. You're only being seen from the waist up.
You can sit there in your underwear.
Do people even have pants on anymore? Beautiful men's suits for like $25, $30, $40. I mean,
Wow.
Suits were originally $500, $600. I mean, I think they're just trying to get rid of stuff.
Yikes.
Things are changing. What we see as necessary is changing.
That's a really interesting observation. It's not something I would have had my finger on the pulse about. So there you go. So COVID is changing things. And do you think COVID makes then maybe some of these superpowers easier to practice? Or is it just a matter of we all need to look around and do we have to pick one? Can we be a triple superhero or quadruple?
Quadruple. I think it's making us, I think we're more caught up in the busyness and the craziness of, especially if you have young children and there's two of you working and you're up first thing in the morning and getting everybody ready for the day and out the door and daycare and school and yada, yada, yada. I mean, you really don't have a moment to breathe. So you're so distracted. And I think perhaps in that way, COVID has made everyone slow down enough to have some time to look and think and see what's necessary and what's not necessary. I mean, certainly going back to school, I think about what back to school looked like in my household with two boys and the wardrobes and the calculators and the notepads and the backpacks and new sneakers and all that kind of stuff. And I know I've said this before, I came from a life of privilege. I used to look at it and say, how does the average person outfit their kids to go back to school? I mean, our school system didn't provide pens and paper and glue sticks and scissors, and I mean, all that stuff was up to each individual family to provide for their one child. And hundreds of dollars of stuff, and and you can't expect that the teachers were going to.
That does happen as well. And so you're saying now with this year with school being different, although kids are back in school in Ontario, I think in pretty much every province across Canada. Now, not the universities, but the elementary, middle, and high schools. Yeah, my heart goes out to the teachers out there. I've been reading some stuff. It's pretty hard. And I confess, I have an education degree and I've been in the classroom. Teaching is always a demanding job. Now it's almost unbelievably demanding, unbearably demanding. But yeah, so if you're a teacher and I think your superpower is just getting through the day, but we digress slightly. So you want to talk more about using the power of the pocketbook. And so we've talked, I think, on the show before about buying secondhand, about what are some other tips. We can talk about the plate, power of the plate connected to specifically to climate change. But what about if people aren't in our position where they aren't downsizing, they still, maybe a lot of people still have to go out to work. And so what are choices that can be made that are better for the climate?
Well, certainly buying local is very helpful. It helps your neighbors, obviously, with their small businesses. Less transportation cost. so less emissions being put out. Buying local helps the local economy. It's not all
Yeah.
money, and that money goes back into helping your neighbors pay their bills and their rent and whatever, versus all of it going to he who shall not be named, who hoards billions of dollars. Certainly the accessibility of buying online really helps when your time is of the essence, and maybe when you're home and bored and you don't want to go out, but it's not doing anything to help the economy. And it's contributing to more things being delivered. One of my friends was saying that she lives in New York City, and she's like, it's amazing how many deliveries are being made up and down the streets of Brooklyn, Manhattan.
Well, okay, so buying less in general, buying local whenever possible, and putting the power of your plate and your pocketbook together. And again, we've talked about this farmers market, growing as much as you can. Obviously, that's an economy, but it's also healthier to eat fresh fruit and vegetables like that. It has a lower carbon footprint, and it just tastes so much better. Are you still getting tomatoes?
I've still got 3 tomato plants. They're really down to just little tiny ones. I'm like, I should pull those. I pulled my cukes this week. I've still got a number of eggplant that are growing. I'm just going to let it go until the first frost and then see. But my freezer's stocked.
Yeah.
And yes, it did cost me to bring in soil and stuff this year
Mm-hmm.
to get it started and the initial plants, but I've been saving seed. I mean, I'm really trying to walk my talk, really trying to take a look at what I'm producing, sharing the wealth with my neighbors. I think I've mentioned that a couple times. Composting. I don't know. I think the challenge of this time is giving us all the opportunity to think about the world that we want to create and use our superpowers towards that.
Well, and it's interesting because I don't know about in where you are, but wow, there were not a lot of canning jars available in our community. Luckily, we had a lot already, but clearly people are thinking about preserving food. And for me, who's been involved in the transition movement, which we've talked about, which is all about being prepared, being resilient, and it means you depend on that global supply chain as little as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Practically speaking, unless you've got an acreage and your own milk cows and goats and sheep or whatever, to completely unplug from the global supply chain. And it's hard to make your own computer that way, even if you do have one instead. But as much as possible, just doing that. But it's so soul soothing if you enjoy doing it. And if you don't enjoy doing it, then swap with your neighbor who does. Maybe you offer to mow their lawn or, do childcare for them or whatever it is. So it builds community in such a lovely way, or it can. Like I have a friend who is a fan of the show, and I'm going to do a shout out to Lisa there. She's the one who messaged me that after our show with Heather Houston a few weeks ago that she'd been humming ever since she listened to the show. So I'm going to give a shout out to Lisa in Winnipeg, who for a couple of years had her own bee hives in the city on the second floor.
City.
Yeah. She had a second floor balcony, so it's safe in that there's no animals. Like if you have them on the ground floor, you have to have them fenced in case. It's not like there's bears in Winnipeg, but raccoons or whatever. So and even kids, you have to be concerned about them getting at the bees. But it was a perfect spot, second floor balcony. And for several years, some of her friends benefited from this lovely honey that was collected. Now, Lisa and her husband didn't do the bees themselves. They contracted them out to somebody who's a beekeeper.
And would come to there and switch out the screens and all that kind of thing.
Exactly. They just purchased the hives and the bees, and beekeeper did the rest. So it was
interesting.
So creative. Unfortunately, they ran into issues with their bees overwintering this past winter. They had several winters and they didn't make it. So I know that's a sad thing. But that sort of thing is creative, and that's what people are starting to do more and more. Even here in Victoria, where we are now, we were talking to our tenant who in spring went to the city of Victoria, offered residents. They, instead of growing flowers to put in the hanging pots this year, the city grew vegetable
Lovely.
for these seedlings. And so she got a bunch in spring, and she said they did them again, offered the same thing this fall. Because in Victoria, you can grow things in the fall. So she was telling us she just got spinach and lettuce and peas and a whole bunch of things to plant now. The city didn't grow the flowers for hanging baskets, or they didn't grow as many. They pivoted because of the pandemic, decided to offer more people to support
the seedlings. Okay.
Yeah, support resilience in the city by offering people for free. They're free seedlings, and the city has grown them. You just have to sign up, I think, and go and line up in a socially distanced way, I'm sure. You can get 2 of each plant that they had. So
nice.
I think she got 10 different kinds. So that's the sort of thing that is creative and fun and builds community. Who doesn't want to be part of that?
Right. If you're planting more trees in your yard, if you're lucky enough to have the space to plant new trees, can you plant apple trees, pear trees, nuts? I think that the world that we lived in before, we weren't very mindful about much. Some people probably were. I would say most of us were not mindful about what our actions or inactions created. And it feels like we're being given that time to think more about what is it that we want to create. Can we spend our dollars to create that?
And in the article on regenerative agriculture, that was our best in climate this week, I really loved how the Rodale Institute, which wrote this paper that was being discussed in the article, talked about this is not kind of a warning as much as it is an invitation. We can choose the future we want.
Mm-hmm.
And this is coming through more and more, that we can pivot from the scariness of climate change, because it is not going to be good for future generations if we don't change our ways pretty drastically, but pivot towards this is the future that we want. Like you said, our choices help us envision that future. And here we are in 2020, the next 8 to 10 years are pretty important. We happen to be alive for it. And so, as you say, let's be mindful and make choices that we can be proud of, that we can live with, that we can sleep with at night.
Yeah, I think it's envisioning it and then actually following through on what we say we want it to look like. So that goes back to also the other power of your vote.
Yes.
Voting for the legislators that are putting in place plans for what they think it should look like. Standing behind people that really are probably putting their neck out a little bit right now for systemic change. It's not an easy thing. It's a little bit scary to look at what we've known. People do not do change easily. Humans do not like change. And yet it can be an exciting time for all of the opportunity that's available, opportunity for new jobs, opportunity just to reimagine everything.
Not like there wasn't things that were pretty broken.
Yeah. And I think we're seeing how much things were broken.
So a big shout out to vote.
Big shout out to vote.
If you're American.
Oh, yes. If you're American, you got 28 days. Please don't stay home, even if you're not really dedicated to this one particular candidate. Vote for what you think is going to move us forward.
Yeah. I had a conversation on Facebook about voting. She's an American citizen, but who's been living in Canada most of her life. And she was debating about whether or not to vote. I gave her Anne Lamott's quote, which was, our choice is between, in this election on November 3rd, is it? Between a poop sandwich with ground glass in it, or
Anne Lamott does have her way with words, yes.
Or a chicken sandwich, and you are, and said to the people who are undecided, and you're like somebody who's on an airplane being offered, the poop sandwich with glass in it, or the chicken sandwich, and you ask, how is the chicken cooked? I mean,
yeah, so. Exactly.
And actually, this person said, well, I'm obviously not going to vote for Trump, but I have some moral issues around Biden, which I would interpret as probably she's concerned about the abortion issue. Somebody else commented to me, not on that thread, well, if she doesn't vote, she's letting somebody else pick her sandwich. Vote. That's what we're saying. If you choose the poop sandwich, I guess that's your choice.
That's your choice.
We'd encourage the chicken over the poop.
Yeah.
Do we have any good news to pivot from that?
Yeah. So the good news is that China has stepped in. China had been dragging its feet and not wanting to commit under the Paris Accord to being carbon neutral. There are 60 countries that have committed to being carbon neutral by 2050. China, just in the last week, I think it was actually maybe as far back as September 25th or something, they came out and said they will be carbon neutral by 2060. So that's a huge thing. They emit, I think it's 28% of global emissions, and they will have to restructure pretty much everything to get to that. In fact, President Xi, president of Communist China, said in his address to the General Assembly of the UN, quote, "Humankind can no longer afford to ignore the repeated warnings of nature," end quote. Leadership from China. Who'd have thunk it? Obviously, preserving the Communist Party's power remains their top priority. But with this summer's devastating floods on the Yangtze, it seems they're waking up to the fact that pollution and other environmental threats are threats to the Communist Party. So kudos to China for leading on climate.
We know that when they commit to it, they have a plan and they'll move ahead with it, right? It doesn't depend on election cycles for them.
No, it doesn't.
Let's celebrate China today. That works for me.
Yeah.
And our action tip is, if you are in the US,
vote.
And you know what? Let's put on our website. There are ways to find out if you're registered, right? And I know that I'm pretty sure Stephen Colbert has a website dedicated to making sure people are registered.
Oh, that's good to know. I'm not watching TV that late.
Yeah, he's very concerned about voter suppression, and so we'll put that link or possibly another one to make sure you know that it's easy to get registered, like that. If you're American. So we'll put a link up on our website for that. Here in Canada, I think there's 2 elections in the next month, one in Saskatchewan and one in British Columbia. So vote there as well. All right. And our sanity tip, vote and then get off of social media. We won't talk about the stuff that's been going on social media in the US these days and around the current resident of the White House, but it's just so distracting. And
don't feed that energy. Use the energy for your family, use the energy for yourself, use the energy to create what you want the future to look like. Don't buy into the craziness of what's out there right now.
And I'm going to follow our advice because I have to admit I've been on Twitter lately. So
okay, well, so use your superpowers. And we'll catch you next week. Bye-bye. That's this week's episode of Earth Feels. Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me.